The men vanished into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. No footprints back, no bodies recovered, no confirmed sightings. Just a single question that has haunted investigators for decades. Did anyone survive the Cold Bay escape? Like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you're ready to walk into a case where the land itself may have been the executioner, and ask yourself whether freedom was ever possible out here. The alarm did not ring right away. That delay would later become one of the most unsettling details in the official reports. By the time guards realized something was wrong, the prisoners were already gone, swallowed by fog, wind, and the raw emptiness of Cold Bay, Alaska. It was April 1937. And Cold Bay was not a town in the way most Americans understand one. It was an isolated outpost at the edge of the Alaska Peninsula, carved out of tundra and surrounded by icy water, jagged mountains, and unpredictable storms. Temperatures hovered just above freezing. The wind rarely stopped. Visibility could vanish in seconds. Even seasoned outdoorsmen feared the area. The men who escaped were not hardened masterminds. They were inmates assigned to a federal work camp, transferred there because Cold Bay itself was considered a natural barrier. The thinking was simple and brutal. No walls were needed. The wilderness would do the job. According to official records, the escapees slipped away during routine operations. There was no dramatic gunfire, no explosions, no alarms echoing across the bay. Just an absence, an empty bunk, tools left behind, and the realization that several men had chosen to test a theory long accepted by the U.S. government, that no one could survive long enough out there to reach safety. Search teams were deployed almost immediately. Soldiers, local trackers, and pilots scanned the terrain from the air. They found nothing. No campsites, no discarded clothing, no footprints lasting longer than a few hours before the ground erased them. Cold Bay does that. Snow, rain, and wind cover evidence quickly, leaving investigators to work with silence. The names of the escapees appeared briefly in newspapers across the continental United States. Headlines framed the story less as a manhunt and more as a grim inevitability. Most reports assumed the men were already dead. Exposure, starvation, hypothermia, drowning. Pick one, the article suggested. Cold Bay had claimed them, but assumption is not proof. And that distinction would become the heart of the mystery. Investigators documented the timeline carefully. They knew the approximate hour the men disappeared. They knew what supplies were available and, more importantly, what was not. The escapees had no cold weather survival gear, no firearms, no maps designed for wilderness travel. They did not steal boats. There were no missing aircraft. On paper, survival looked impossible. Yet one detail unsettled officials: the direction of travel. Scattered observations suggested the men moved inland, not toward the coast. That decision defied logic. Inland meant mountains, rivers swollen with meltwater, and terrain that even locals avoided. Why would anyone choose that route unless they believed something waited for them beyond it? This question lingered as the search expanded. Pilots flew grid patterns over miles of land. Patrols followed riverbanks and ridgelines. They found animal tracks. They found signs of weather damage. They found reminders of just how small a human presence becomes out there. They did not find bodies. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, the official search was called off. The case file was marked with language that sounded final but wasn't definitive. The escapees were presumed deceased, not confirmed, not proven, just presumed. That distinction mattered to the families. Letters arrived asking for confirmation. Some families refused to accept the assumption. Others quietly believed the wilderness had done what the prison could not. In the absence of evidence, both versions lived side by side. Inside internal memos, however, investigators acknowledged something uncomfortable. Cold Bay had no history of mercy, but it also had a habit of keeping secrets. Planes had vanished there before. Hunters had gone missing without a trace. The land did not always give answers. And then there was the final report detail that rarely made headlines. A guard stated that one of the escapees had previously worked on supply routes and had listened carefully when locals spoke about seasonal travel paths. It was dismissed as meaningless at the time, but years later, that sentence would resurface, underlined in ink. Because if even one of those men understood the land better than officials believed, the entire assumption collapsed. They were supposed to die out there. That was the logic behind Cold Bay as a prison. But logic does not always survive contact with desperation. And when investigators reviewed the last confirmed sighting, they realized something else, something that had been overlooked from the beginning. The escape did not look like panic. It looked planned. The men were no longer being hunted across tundra and ridgelines. Instead, investigators began chasing paper trails, witness recollections, and fragments of information scattered across military logs and weather reports. Cold Bay had not produced bodies, but it had produced questions more than anyone expected. The first troubling realization came from reviewing the weather data. Contrary to early assumptions, conditions in the days immediately following the escape were harsh, but not catastrophic. Temperatures were cold, but not the deadly extremes Cold Bay was infamous for. Winds were strong, yet intermittent. Visibility fluctuated, but there were windows of clear travel. In isolation, none of this proved survival was possible, but it weakened the certainty of death. Investigators then re-examined the escape timeline. The delay in discovery meant the men had hours, possibly longer, before pursuit began. In wilderness survival, time is everything. That window mattered. Attention turned to the prisoners' work assignments. Records showed at least one of the escapees had been involved in unloading supplies and observing transport routes during favorable seasons. He had seen where equipment arrived, how materials moved inland, and which paths were used repeatedly. None of this meant he could navigate the terrain safely, but it meant he understood patterns. Interviews with guards revealed another overlooked detail. The escapees had not taken much with them, but what they did take was specific. Food rations, not tools. Basic clothing, not excess weight. This was not the behavior of men running blindly into the wild. It suggested restraint, calculation. Then came the local accounts. Hunters and workers stationed in nearby areas were questioned months later. Most reported nothing unusual. Cold Bay swallowed sound and movement easily. But one account stood out not because it proved anything, but because it refused to disappear from the record. A civilian contractor recalled seeing what he believed were human tracks near an inland route weeks after the escape. He did not follow them. He assumed they belonged to authorized personnel. By the time he learned about the escape, weather had erased whatever might have been there. Investigators could not verify the claim, but they also could not disprove it. As the years passed, the case file grew thinner, but not quieter. Internal correspondence shows that officials debated whether Cold Bay truly functioned as an absolute barrier. Some argued the escape proved nothing, men could wander for weeks before dying without a trace. Others disagreed. They pointed to historical precedents of people surviving longer than expected in extreme environments through discipline and sheer determination. What unsettled them most was the absence of remains. Cold Bay was dangerous, but it was not a void. Search teams had found bodies there before hunters lost to storms, aircraft crews killed in crashes. The land eventually revealed its dead. The silence surrounding this case felt different. Years later, when Cold Bay transitioned away from its role as a detention site, the escape resurfaced in administrative reviews. It was referenced not as a failure, but as an anomaly. The official conclusion remained unchanged: presumed dead. But presumed is not closure. Families continued to ask questions. Some filed inquiries decades after the fact, hoping new technology or renewed interest might produce answers. None came. No DNA, no recovered clothing, no personal effects, nothing that definitively closed the door. Then, in a routine archival review, a detail surfaced that had never been fully explored: flight logs. During the period following the escape, multiple aircraft passed through Cold Bay for unrelated operations. One log referenced a brief, unscheduled delay due to unexpected ground activity near a makeshift landing area. The note was vague. It did not mention prisoners. It did not trigger an investigation at the time. But decades later, reading it in context, investigators paused. The report was filed days after the escape. No follow-up was recorded. It did not prove contact. It did not confirm survival, but it raised a possibility no one wanted to confront: that the men may not have been moving entirely alone. If assistance, intentional or accidental, had occurred, even briefly, it would rewrite the assumptions underpinning the case. It would mean Cold Bay had not been an execution. It had been a gamble, and gambles sometimes pay off. By the time modern investigators revisited the file, most witnesses were gone. Records were incomplete. The land had changed. What remained was a pattern of near misses, erased evidence, and official certainty built more on belief than proof. The escape was meant to demonstrate the futility of running. Instead, it left behind one of the most unresolved questions in American penal history. And just when authorities believed the story could go no further, a final document emerged, one that suggested the men may have been closer to civilization than anyone ever admitted. The document that changed everything was not dramatic. No headlines, no urgency stamped across the page. It was a transportation memorandum, buried deep in Cold Bay's administrative archives, written in careful, unemotional language. But what it suggested quietly challenged decades of certainty. It confirmed that, during the same window investigators believed the escapees were still alive, a civilian-operated aircraft had made an unscheduled ground stop inland far from the main camp. The reason listed was routine terrain assessment. No passengers were officially recorded as boarding or disembarking. No incident report followed. On its own, the memo proved nothing. But when paired with the flight log note referencing unexpected ground activity, it created a gap in the official narrative that could not be sealed. Investigators revisiting the case faced an uncomfortable truth. Cold Bay's reputation had done much of the work for them. The assumption of death had replaced proof. The wilderness had been treated as a verdict. Modern analysts reconstructed the escape using what little could be verified. Based on weather data, daylight hours, and known travel routes, they concluded that survival beyond the first critical days was not impossible. Unlikely, yes, but not impossible. And once that line was crossed, the men entered a gray zone where outcomes multiplied. The case also forced a reassessment of Cold Bay itself. During its operational years, it was promoted as inescapable, but historical reviews revealed inconsistencies. Supplies moved through regularly. Aircraft came and went. Contractors, pilots, and temporary workers cycled in and out. It was isolated, but not sealed. That distinction mattered. No evidence ever emerged that confirmed outside help. There were no witnesses who claimed to have aided escapees. No records of missing passengers. No later arrests tied back to Cold Bay. But absence of evidence did not erase the possibility of coincidence, of being in the wrong place at the right moment. When federal authorities formally closed the case for the final time, they did so with language that has since become infamous among researchers. The escapees were listed as presumed deceased, fate unknown. It was an ending designed to sound complete while admitting it was not. Families were notified again. By then, most had already lived their lives under the shadow of uncertainty. Some accepted the final wording, others did not. A few quietly believed survival was possible not because of hope, but because nothing had ever proven otherwise. Over time, the story faded from public memory. Cold Bay itself transformed. Military operations replaced the prison camp. New structures rose where old paths once existed. The land changed, but it did not speak. Researchers who studied the case later noted one final, haunting detail. In other Cold Bay disappearances, hunters, pilots, workers' physical evidence eventually surfaced. Wreckage, remains, clothing, something tangible. This case stood apart because it produced none of those things. Not one confirmed trace. That silence remains the story's most unsettling feature. Did the men perish slowly in the wilderness, claimed by a landscape that leaves no witnesses? Or did they reach a thin line of chance, one aircraft, one overlooked moment that carried them beyond Cold Bay and out of history? There is no dramatic confession, no recovered body, no final answer waiting to be uncovered by new technology. The case has reached the end of what records can provide. What remains is a question that refuses to die. Cold Bay was designed to be the last stop, a place where escape meant disappearance. And in that sense, the system may have worked exactly as intended, because whether the men died in the wilderness or lived somewhere beyond it, they were never seen again. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling outcome of all. If you think the story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.